Hello and welcome to Forward Boldly. I'm your host, Christine Niles. Human trafficking is a $150 billion a year business. And the number one destination, the number one consumer of child sex abuse material is the United States, to our great shame. The hit film, The Sound of Freedom, which was released on July 4th, number one film in the nation on that day, and which has exceeded all expectations, brought light to this crucial issue, this most disturbing topic that I wish more people were aware of. I'm going to be talking about all of that in this episode. As a warning, there will be some spoilers of the film Sound of Freedom. If you have not seen it, please, I urge you, go and watch it. Go and watch it. It's a tremendous film. Don't pay any attention to the naysayers and the people who've lied about the film or about Tim Ballard, who's portrayed in the film. It truly is one of the most important films that have come out in a very long time. Very powerful. It will leave you changed. It really will. It will stick with you. But also warning, because we're going to be discussing a very disturbing topic, child sex trafficking. I'm not going to show anything graphic or explicit, but we will be discussing a very difficult and dark topic. So just be aware of that, especially if you have any children in the room. They probably don't want to watch this episode. All right, we'll get into all that and more, but first there's still time to sign up for our Autumn Retreat at Sea, first time along the New England coast. It's going to be September 23rd through the 30th, and there will be ports of call in Rhode Island, Maine, and Canada, among others. So beautiful meditative setting out in the sea. You'll be, with like-minded Catholics, wonderful fellowship, praying the rosary every day. There'll be adoration, confession, mass, and of course, some powerful and compelling talks by Michael Voris. I highly recommend that you go. I've been a number of times, and it really is a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I believe the prices the fares have just been reduced. So you can go sign up at churchmilitant.com/retreat at sea autumn. That is churchmilitant.com/retreat at sea autumn. Like I said, human trafficking is a $150 billion a year industry. And you have Mexican drug cartels now that are mutating and morphing into adding now not just drugs, but human trafficking as well, because they see what a lucrative business it is. And some are actually saying that the human trafficking industry from Mexico is actually surpassing that of the drug trafficking from Mexico. And as you know, we've got the border along Mexico. And so much of that human trafficking is coming up here into the United States. Now, Tim Ballard, as I said, was portrayed in the film Sound of Freedom. He founded Operation Underground Railroad, which works on infiltrating pedophile networks around the world in the darkest places on the globe, infiltrating them in order to rescue the children victimized in these operations, as well as bring these traffickers and pedophiles to justice. So a tremendous organization. Tim Ballard, tremendous man. I encourage you. He's got a lot of interviews online, as well as there's some documentaries about him and his work as well. I encourage you, just watch them. It is amazing, absolutely amazing. And also the way that God has worked in this man's life, the miracles that have been wrought through his prayer, through his acts, his heroism and sacrifice. Let me just say, would that more Catholics were like Tim Ballard. And Ballard is a Mormon. But the example of his heroism and courage and trust in God and all of that, he put so many Catholics to shame. I'll just say it right now. He put so many Catholics to shame. We could learn a lot from Tim Ballard. But here he was at the Turning Point Action Conference recently, where he acknowledged the federal government is actually participating in child sex trafficking because through Health and Human Services, the Department of Health and Human Services, which offers the Unaccompanied Children program, they're actually placing children in the hands of unvetted sponsors, some of whom turn out to be pedophiles or child traffickers. This is a true story. I'm going to get into that more, but I'm also going to get into the complicity of the U.S. bishops and the Catholic Church in America in helping to facilitate this. Let's take a look at that clip.
85,000 of those kids show up at the southern border over the last 2 years, and they're lost. They're disappeared. And here's the important thing. There's something I call the economy of pedophilia. Okay? Did you know that the United States is the #1 consumer of child sex material in the world? Okay, so we are the demand. If 85,000 children show up at our border and are released into that economy of pedophilia, what do you think's going on?
Wow.
And worse yet,
Florida's #3.
Worse yet, you know what happens? I've been down there. The traffickers give the kids a little piece of paper with a name on it, of the sponsor. And Health and Human Services gets those kids, by policy, all they can do is call the number, and George Smith or whoever picks up the phone, oh yeah, Jose Gonzalez, yeah, I'm the sponsor. Okay, they used to have to come pick the kid up. It's harder, by the way. It's harder to adopt a cat from a shelter than it is to come pick up a kid at the border. Do you know that? And now George Smith doesn't have to pick the kid up anymore. Your taxpayer dollars are putting that kid on a plane, train, automobile, whatever it is, and shipping that child to the sponsor given by a child trafficker in Mexico, and the United States government is therefore complicit. The United States government is fulfilling and completing the final leg of a child trafficking experience. That's our country right now. And that's why they don't want you to see Sound of Freedom.
And that is indeed why they don't want you watching Sound of Freedom, because it highlights this horrific practice taking place here in the US. Now, just about a week or two before Sound of Freedom came out, I interviewed whistleblower Tara Lee Rodas. Tara Lee Rodas worked for HHS. She worked to help these unaccompanied children, to place them in these sponsors' homes. And what she found absolutely shocked her. She testified before a congressional committee just this past April. Let's hear a short clip from that testimony.
Today, children will be sold for sex. Today, children will call a hotline to report they are being abused, neglected, and trafficked. And we don't know if they're going to get the help they need. For nearly a decade, unaccompanied children have been suffering in the shadows. And I have to confess, I knew nothing about their suffering until 2021, when I volunteered to help the Biden administration with the crisis at the southern border. As part of Operation Artemis, I was deployed to the Pomona Fairplex Emergency Intake Site in California to help HHS, Office of Refugee Resettlement, reunite children with sponsors in the United States. I thought I was going to help place children in loving homes. Instead, I discovered that children are being trafficked through a sophisticated network that begins with recruiting in home country, smuggling to the US border, and ends when ORR delivers a child to a sponsor. Some sponsors are criminals and traffickers and members of transnational criminal organizations. Some sponsors view children as commodities and assets to be used for earning income. This is why we are witnessing an explosion of labor trafficking. Now, whether it's intentional or not, it could be argued that the United States government has become the middleman in a large-scale, multi-billion-dollar child trafficking operation that is run by bad actors seeking to profit off of the lives of children.
And so, like I said, I invited her onto my show. She spoke a bit more in depth in what she saw. And here's a clip from that interview where I talk about how shocked I was to find out that children were being placed in the hands of gang members. I was shocked to read that some of these young children were being put in the hands of MS-13 gang members.
Yes, 18th Street Gang, Russian Balkan crime syndicates, and this I discovered because of a brave whistleblower from DHS. So there is a true American hero. His name is Aaron Stevenson. Once a Marine, always a Marine, right? He was a Marine. He dedicated his life to public service with Department of Homeland Security. He actually worked what was called the TOC mission, which is transnational organized crime. And he identified in early 2021 when all the restrictions were lifted off of this program and children were just being funneled through the system, he identified the very first case ever of a person on the TOC watch list, the Transnational Organized Crime Watch List, attempting to sponsor kids. And then it just started skyrocketing. And so now we have members of transnational organized crime operating here in the United States, and they are using these children for nefarious things.
You can watch that interview. It's the June 27th episode of Forward Boldly. I encourage you to please watch the whole thing and share it with your family and friends and others. Raise public awareness about this, because we have to put an end to this. There's evil going on that's being facilitated by our government. And why? The bottom line is money. It's money. I mentioned before, $150 billion a year business globally. Billions of dollars here in the U.S. Let's take a look at another clip from my interview with Tara Lee Rodas.
So the sex trafficking trade is a multi-billion-dollar trade. I didn't know this when I first deployed for this mission. But, police officers explained to me, they're like, look, you can sell a kilo of Coke one time, but once they have a child, they can sell that child over and over and over again. And that's what they were doing. I was hearing stories of the children who were being prostituted across Mexico. We had one little boy, he was only 8 years old. And the case manager, completely distraught, she said, Tara, I just don't understand how somebody could do this to a child. She said, my child. She said, whose case I'm working on, he's only 8. And he's in diapers now because he was sexually abused the entire way. And this is what's happening to the children. And I had no idea. And so I couldn't remain silent. Jesus is very serious about how we treat his children, and God's children are not for sale. And so I felt it was important to come forward and to tell these stories. And when I had come forward through every chain that I knew, reported to every law enforcement that I could, I then was waiting, for action. I'm looking at the news and, trying to see, are they recovering children? And when I didn't see immediate action, that's when I went to Project Veritas and James O'Keefe. They sent crews, they knocked on doors, and it was horrific what the children were telling them.
So I mentioned Project Veritas. They did an undercover sting. And let's take a look at a short clip from that undercover investigation where they actually went knocking on doors at the places of concern that were pointed out by Tara Lee Rodas.
Project Veritas put boots on the ground, visiting scores of addresses the whistleblower shared from case files she worked on. What we found was shocking. Young children living with multiple older, unrelated men. And in one case from Gulf Freeway in Houston, Texas, a young girl who admits to her female sponsor using her for sex work.
¿Quién te patrocinó a ti?
Una tía, pero me corrió en la casa. Bueno, porque ella me ofrecía y a mí no me gustaba eso.
¿Te ofrecía qué?
Me ofrecía con los hombres, pues.
Pero ella, ¿cuántos hombres ella te obligó a estar con cuántos hombres?
Bueno, con muchos, ni porque no me gustaba lo que me hacía, me obligaba.
¿Ella de verdad era tu tía o fue alguien que se...?
Dice que ella me conocía desde chiquita, pero yo no la conocía.
I don't believe that this is something that HHS wants people to know.
All right, so here's my question. How many of those migrant children being pimped out, being housed in these unvetted sponsors' compounds and apartments and homes, how many of them were placed there by Catholic Charities? How many of them were placed there by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, USCCB's Office of Migration Services? How many? I wouldn't be surprised if a vast majority of them were. I mean, that's the work right now of Catholic Charities on the border. It's primarily taking these unaccompanied children. Okay, unaccompanied means they're unaccompanied. They're alone. They're alone. Placing them in the hands of sponsors who are not vetted. As Tim Ballard pointed out, it's actually more difficult to adopt a pet, to adopt a cat or a dog, than it is to take one of these children and place them in the homes of a so-called sponsor. A sponsor who ends up being a pedophile or child trafficker, using that child for sex. This is, and this is another story that Tim Ballard actually shared, a true story of a girl that they rescued in New York. And she shared her story. And she said that she was trafficked from Central America. She was taken from Central America. And they went to a part of the border that essentially had no wall, nothing. And they walked right through. The trafficker walked right through with her when she was a little girl. She was taken up to New York, and she was forced into sexual slavery. She was raped multiple times a day by older men. And this went on for years until they rescued her. And this is one of the reasons why Ballard and people like him support a wall, building a wall. Because if there had been a wall, it would have forced the traffickers to go through the port of entry where there is it's a checkpoint. They have to check cars. And because they have very good ICE agents there who know what to look for, the traffickers probably would have been caught if they had to go through the port of entry. And that little girl could have been spared years of misery, a childhood of misery, destroyed her innocence. But the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, like I said, are complicit. The USCCB gets a massive amount of federal money for its Office of Migration Services. We'll be right back with the show, but I'd like to take a moment to encourage you to sign up for a premium subscription if you haven't already. It's only $10 a month, which is a really rock bottom price, and it gets you thousands of hours of content on everything across the board: theology, philosophy, apologetics, history, everything. We have things for little children. We have things for adults. While we give a lot of our content away for free, the work that we do here does not come for free. It costs us money. The $10 a month will go a long way in helping us to continue to produce top quality, faith-based content, all with a view towards spreading truth, ultimately for the salvation of souls. So if you want to support us, please consider signing up for premium at churchmilitant.com/go premium. That's churchmilitant.com/go premium. Thank you so much for your support. In some cases, it's almost up to half of its operating budget in some years, because each year the numbers are different. The amount of the grants that they get are different for each year. But there was one year, I'll show you a chart shortly, where almost half of their revenue for the year came from the federal government specifically for their services for migrants. Let me read from an article in the Daily Signal. U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Migration and Refugee Services lists 10 federal grants for migration and refugee services on its website, including 8 from HHS to provide services for newly arrived refugees, strengthen refugee marriage and families, unaccompanied alien children placement and reunification in the U.S., a joint grant with Catholic Charities USA to provide training and assistance regarding human trafficking. Now, what is the relationship between Catholic Charities USA and the U.S. Bishops Conference? Well, some years ago, they made a formal agreement in which Catholic Charities agreed to formally work on behalf of the USCCB in emergency response situations, disaster and relief and that sort of thing. And so Catholic Charities acts on behalf of the Catholic Church in these relief efforts in the U.S. And among those relief efforts is the placing of migrant children with families, with sponsors. Let's read about Catholic Charities from the same Daily Signal article. According to Forbes, Catholic Charities USA was the 13th largest U.S. charity last year. Of its total $4.7 billion in revenues, Catholic Charities received $1.4 billion from government support, compared with $1 billion in private donations and $2.2 billion in other income. The website complicitclergy.com did an analysis. They crunched the numbers, and this is what they found out. Between 2008 and 2022, Catholic organizations received over $3 billion, $3 billion with a B, for immigration-related activities. 1.1 billion of that, again, from 2008 to 2022, 1.1 billion of that went to the USCCB. 1.9 billion went to Catholic charities, and a few $100,000 went to various other Catholic aid organizations scattered around the country. But as you can see, the USCCB and Catholic charities were by far the largest beneficiaries of government grants, specifically with regard to migration services. It's the unaccompanied alien children program that is most susceptible to child sex trafficking for obvious reasons. Unaccompanied children. The federal government gave Catholic organizations $766 million between 2008 and 2022, specifically to go toward the unaccompanied children's program. $766 million. That is a lot of money. And the way it works is that for every single child that's brought across the border, there's a certain number, there's a dollar tag attached, okay, in the many thousands of dollars. And so there's a check, okay, that's cut out for every single child that crosses that border. And the way it works with these child traffickers is they will take a child, maybe they kidnap him off the street or wherever they get him from, and they traffic him through the HHS Unaccompanied Children's Program. They have a sponsor, a so-called sponsor. They make some paperwork trying to prove his so-called relationship with the child, although it could be forged documents, easily forged documents. And all they have to do is show the paperwork or mail it in or email it, whatever you have to do. You don't have to be there in person. Perhaps showing the child's birth certificate, something like that. And then boom, off you go. And as Tim Ballard noted, it used to be that the sponsor would actually have to show up in person to take the child. Now they don't even have to do that. They just stay home and the government will pay. The government will pay however much money it costs to put that child in a bus or a plane or a train, wherever, and take him deliver him right to the doorstep of the pedophile. Again, to be tortured and abused for who knows how long. I myself crunched the numbers with regard to the USCCB financials, specifically regarding their migration office, the total government contract and grants revenue. And this is what I found based on the financial reports that they published on their site. In 2016, okay, the last year that Obama really was in charge, $95 million went to the USCCB's migration services. That was almost half of the USCCB's total revenue that year, $95 million. And that really was kind of the high watermark of their grants and government contracts. But then, as you can see, Trump comes into office and he slashes that number and it keeps going down. So in 2017, under Trump, USCCB migration services, $72 million. Next year after that, it goes down to $48 million. In 2019, it goes slightly up to $52 million. But then in 2020, $47 million. So you can kind of see why the bishops hated Trump so much, why they were constantly speaking out against Trump, because he was cutting their cash cow. Well, look what's happening now under Biden. It's gone back way up, and it's projected to keep going up if things keep going this way. 2021, $67,536,834 to the USCCB's migration services. That's 1/3 of their 2021 revenue, okay? Which is a hefty chunk. Which is why the USCCB is constantly lobbying for immigration, constantly. If you go to their website, if you listen to the messages that they put out, how many times do they make a plea that's somewhat related to immigration? How many times? I mean, it's countless. It's countless the number of times. They're always talking about immigration. How often do they talk about the pro-life efforts? I mean, I don't know. They've never actually put out any sort of national plea for pro-life efforts the way that they have with regard to immigration. And I spoke to someone who used to work for the USCCB for several years, this person. And this individual, okay, I vetted the individual. This person was there absolutely working very closely with top leadership at the USCCB. And this person told me directly that, I'm going to use they, okay, not because I'm transgender and using neutral pronouns, because I want to protect my source's identity. So I'm not going to reveal whether it is a male or a female, but they said that the pro-life office at the USCCB was the most neglected office there, the most neglected, and that the vast majority of the people working at the USCCB are Democrats, all about social justice, all about immigration. That was the one thing that everyone seemed to want to talk about constantly, totally neglecting the pro-life office. Let's go ahead and watch a clip from Catholic reporter Ben Bergquam. He's talking to Steve Bannon, another Catholic, about the problem with Catholic Charities and how it is facilitating child trafficking at the border under the cover of helping immigrants with the help of the U.S. bishops.
So this is part of Catholic Charities. Actually, Catholic Charities is right here, McAllen, Texas, but they've just bought this building because they've run out of space. They have hundreds of people in this building, run out of space, and now they're filling up this building to continue the trafficking that the cartels have done. They're making hundreds of millions of dollars on this, and ironically, right across the road from them at this corner is the bus stop. So they simply just walk them across, put them on a bus, continue the trafficking into America to a city near here, or they fill up the SUVs that constantly come up here, park. We've got vans down here, and they take them to the airport. This is human trafficking, and it's being brought to you by Joe Biden and the Open Borders Left. We have leftist NGOs that are taking your tax dollars out of your pockets to help facilitate the cartels trafficking into America.
All right, so I mentioned Sound of Freedom. As many of you know, there was some pushback against the film. There was Charles Bramesco writing for The Guardian, calling it a QAnon adjacent film, whatever that means, QAnon adjacent film, followed by a writer named Miles Klee writing for the Rolling Stone, again, saying that there were themes, QAnon themes in the film. He mocked the so-called boomer crowd and how much they coughed, just a complete mocking, saying that he was disgusted by the film. And that was followed by a few other reviews as well that were similarly negative. When I saw these reviews, I cannot even tell you how angry I was. For anyone who has seen this film, it literally has nothing to do with QAnon. The film itself was written and produced before QAnon was even a thing. If you watch interviews with Eduardo Verástegui, who's the producer, this film, it took 8 years to get this film to the screen because of all the obstacles that were thrown in its way. 8 years, long before QAnon was ever even a thing. So that doesn't even make sense to call it a QAnon adjacent film. And then, one of the reviews was saying that it's fear-mongering. It's trying to create moral panic. Okay, my response to that is, all right, let's just pretend for a moment, okay, that the numbers are inflated. I don't think they're inflated. I don't think they're inflated at all. I think it is a serious problem. But let's just say you're a movie reviewer who thinks the numbers may be inflated, all right? You don't think that there are millions of children who are trafficked. You might just think maybe there are thousands, maybe there are hundreds. Shouldn't you be glad that there's a film that's bringing light to this topic, bringing awareness so that Americans can go and do something about this to put a stop to this heinous evil and filth? Shouldn't you be glad that children are being helped by this? I don't understand this response. And the only thing that my mind goes to when I see people trashing an incredible film like Sound of Freedom that is literally about the rescuing of children from child sex slavery, which happens. It happens. And it's a true story. They're true victims. The only thing that my mind goes to when I see people like this mocking it, dismissing it, discouraging other people from seeing it is I think you're a pedophile enabler, or maybe you're a pedophile yourself. And good thing, these people got a lot of backlash on social media, a great deal of backlash on social media from people who are far less kind than me. Comments like, maybe we need to check the hard drives at The Guardian. Maybe we need to check the computers at Rolling Stone. And is it really any coincidence that the same people mocking and trashing Sound of Freedom are the same exact people who are either part of or promoting the LGBT agenda? Is that really any coincidence? Where today in this world, in this society, is there more of a push for grooming and sexualizing young children than in the LGBTQ community? Where? On May 16th, I interviewed David Arthur Kendall, who is a former transgender woman. He's a biological man. He was sexually abused at a very, very young age, about 6 years old, and immediately went into prostitution as an adolescent, and then eventually started experiencing gender dysphoria, wanting to be a girl, and then beginning to dress like a girl, and became a transgender prostitute, essentially. Thanks be to God. God rescued him from that lifestyle, took him out of it, and now he speaks out against it. He calls it the LGBTQ cult. And he said that essentially the entire cult is meant to groom and sexualize and victimize children. That's what it's all about, according to him. And this is a man who lived it. It's not me talking. It's this fellow who is a transgender prostitute who lived that lifestyle for many, many, many years. He says it's a cult, and the whole point is to sexualize and groom children. And we see it everywhere. We see it now in public schools where they're trying to sexualize children from a very young age. And I think Tim Ballard makes a great point. Why is consent so important in the transgender community? Why is it that they're pushing so hard for minors to be able to consent to mutilation, to surgeries that mutilate their bodies from a young age without their parents' knowledge? Why? Why is that so important for them, that child's consent? It's because they want children to be able to consent to sex from a young age. It is a pedophile's dream. They're salivating over this. All the things that these pedophiles have been pushing for years and years and years, our politicians and our schools and Hollywood and celebrities are all doing it for them now. That's why. But back to QAnon. A friend of mine posted my interview with Tara Lee Rodas. And believe it or not, someone got on social media that I'd never heard of him before in my life, just got on there and accused me of being QAnon. Look, I don't even know what QAnon is. I've never looked into QAnon. I have no affiliation with it. I've never promoted theories of QAnon. I've just never even looked into it. And yet here I am being smeared with being QAnon, all because I interviewed a whistleblower who she herself saw this with her own eyes, that children were being placed with unvetted sponsors who were then doing nefarious things with those children. And then she was kicked out. She was retaliated against by HHS, by the government. Again, I asked why. She said, because it's money. It's all about the money. A multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry profiting off the backs and the lives of these poor children. It should disgust and outrage every single individual who knows about this, who learns about it. Nobody should be dismissing this. And something else that Tim Ballard talked about, it's not just the push back against Sound of Freedom, but even before they aired Sound of Freedom, Tim Ballard was talking about how he and his organization, Operation Underground Railroad, they were getting attacked for their work, and they were getting attacked by people that they thought would have supported them, by politicians, by journalists, by various other individuals. It was like friendly fire. And they didn't understand at first what was going on. They didn't understand, why would politicians lie about our work? Why would these journalists smear us about our work, rescuing children? Why? And I've got to tell you, I can relate to this so well. I can relate to this so well because I experienced that exact same thing. Many of you know I'm an investigative journalist. That's my primary work. I specialize in exposing predator clergy. I've been doing this really from the start of my time here at Church Militant, and I've exposed all sorts of clergy all over the church, in the modern church. But then it was when I started turning my attention to traditionalist clergy. First in the Society of St. Pius X, SSPX, but then I've also reported on the FSSP and various other traditionalist clergy. But when I first started exposing the SSPX, the clergy abuse there, the clergy corruption and cover-up back in 2020, I was blown away. I was blown away by the vicious backlash that I got from traditionalists. It was more vicious than anything that I had ever experienced in my years up till then of investigative journalism exposing clerical predators. It was worse than anything that I had ever gotten or received from the so-called Novus Ordo church. And I have to tell you in the beginning, I was just shocked. I was shocked. I have to say I was a little bit naive at the time because I just wasn't expecting that sort of pushback. But it was vicious. It was vicious. All sorts of lies being spread about me, that I had an abortion or that I left my husband and family to partake in pursue a career in media. Just absolutely flat out false things. And like I said, I could so understand where Tim Ballard was coming from. This just sort of like, hey, I'm out here exposing predators. I'm helping victims. Why am I being attacked over this? And you realize that these individuals attacking you aren't really that concerned about the victims. They don't really care that much about the children. They care about protecting the institution because somehow the institution benefits them. I hope you're enjoying the show. The rest of the show is behind the paywall, so please go to churchmilitant.com to watch the rest. For those who are not premium subscribers, you can sign up at churchmilitant.com/go premium. See you there.